Most humans are social beings, with a fundamental need for a sense of belonging. There is a wide variety in how that need is met, but I think it is safe to say that communications plays an integral role in establishing and maintaining bonds in most environments. Hi, and welcome to this self-help presentation on interpersonal communications. We will be addressing the subject of interpersonal communications based on a theory that was developed by Dr. Eric Berne called transactional analysis, or TA. TA provides a practical and intuitive model for understanding human communications. It has been the subject of many self-help books, which I think is a testament to its intuitiveness. As you practice the principles of TA, you will become more mindful of your own thoughts and become better able to express yourself confidently. Notice that the word appropriate is highlighted on this slide. We will be assessing interactions throughout this presentation based on appropriateness rather than judging them as right or wrong. Okay, let's get started. We begin by exploring the theory of transactional analysis in order for you to decide whether or not it makes sense. In my opinion, it will be difficult to practice the principles of TA if you don't agree that the theory is an accurate description of communication dynamics. All of the terms used in this presentation will be defined to assure that the ideas are being accurately portrayed. Once we have an understanding of the theory, we can begin exploring how it is applied in real life and participate in some activities to further clarify the principles. As I mentioned before, we are complex creatures, so we will look a little deeper into Dr. Berne's theory of mind to examine the nuances of communications and become mindful of our internal dialogue. We will wrap up with some tips on how to practice the principles and some suggestions for further study. I would like you to take a moment and imagine that you are only a few hours old. What do you imagine is going through our minds at this point? In fact, do you imagine we are thinking at all? Here is a definition of thinking that may help you contemplate the previous question. We may not have the tools to do much reasoning, but we may well be considering the input from our senses as to whether or not they are pleasurable or painful, comfortable or uncomfortable. We may be building familiarity and creating bonds. We do know some things about the brain at this point. We are born with most of our gray matter in place, billions of neurons. Neurological growth mostly involves the connections between neurons to form networks and makes the connections more efficient. This is a growth in our white matter. Now let's consider how Dr. Berne began to conceptualize his theory of mind. You're looking at his basic model. He believed that our minds developed three basic personas that he referred to as ego states. He labeled them parent, adult, and child. He further defined the parent ego as nurturing parent and critical parent, and the child ego as adapted child and free child. I think Dr. Berne would have described the newborn as a pristine example of the free child, uninhibited, self-centered, and demanding. All good qualities to promote survival. Also, qualities that can create social difficulties as we mature. The free child now begins a journey of learning and begins to adapt to its environment. It doesn't get very far before it learns the meaning of no, no. But it is also learning that it can begin to manipulate its environment depending on what skills are required to get its needs met. In parallel with the formation of the adapted child ego state, the child is absorbing information from the authority figures in its life. At first, this is usually its parents, but over time it will include extended family, teachers, society in general, as well as culture. There will be a broad range of influence, and I would even include media. The effect will depend on the level of authority the person ascribes to the source. Whatever the authoritative source, there will be some input that we can label as nurturing. This influence will be supportive and provide the person with security and recognition. It may be viewed as a source of comfort and validation. It can, however, also be a source of overprotection that becomes an obstacle to the person developing as an autonomous, independent individual. The other authoritative influence can be described as critical. It can promote the development of social and cultural norms, a sense of discipline and order, and instill ambition. It can also be dysfunctional and erode self-esteem, self-efficacy, and promote fear and anxiety. At some point in our development, the adult ego state begins to emerge. We synthesize all of our influences and develop our unique adult self. There are characteristics to this ego state that can truly help us to have effective interactions with others. The process of maturation is not always successful. Sometimes the effects of our sources of influence are never critiqued by our adult ego and are expressed in ways that are dysfunctional. For example, a person may have been heavily influenced by negative input that in fact was erroneous. Unfortunately, the adult ego never took the time to assess the reality of the input and continues to operate under its influence. Healthy development depends on the emergence of an autonomous adult ego. One term we haven't brought up to this point is transaction. Dr. Byrne envisioned interpersonal exchanges as being similar to a commercial transaction. In other words, we give something in exchange for receiving something in return. For example, if you're walking down a corridor and someone approaches you, you might say hi. You have now made an investment, and you expect a hi in return. If the person ignores you, then that becomes an unsatisfactory transaction. This is similar to have given this person some money with the expectation of receiving something of equal value in return. It is easy to see that if nothing is given in return, there is a high probability of having a negative reaction, a sense of having been cheated. Looking at communications this way provides us insight as to how our emotions come into play and what ego state tends to respond. At this point, you may be thinking this seems very straightforward and neatly packaged. In many ways, you would be right, but we are complex creatures and don't really fit into simple models. We have described a theory of mind, but by no means think of it as addressing all that goes on. Humans have a diverse set of temperaments, diversity of brain development, and instinctual and autonomic processes at work. This model is limited, but still very useful. TA addresses communication issues and suggests ways in which we can be more effective when interacting with others. One of the main benefits of practicing its principles is the reduction of 3 negative emotions: anger, resentment, and frustration. TA can affect not only direct verbal interactions, but also the nonverbal elements, such as body language, facial expressions, and tone of voice. Let's take a closer look at each ego state and begin thinking about how we have been influenced and how that influence may be being expressed today. Read this description of the parent ego state and think about who has influenced your opinions, beliefs, and values. Hopefully you were able to identify some of the major players and have some sense of whether their influence has been beneficial or perhaps harmful. Now ask yourself some questions. An honest inventory of how you've been affected can help you to identify changes you would like to make. It may also help to have a trusted friend assess your behaviors. Now consider your child ego state. Did you grow up in an environment that made you feel secure and promoted your independence? Were you allowed to address issues directly, or did you have to be circuitous and manipulative? As with all of the ego states, there are usually positive and negative aspects to consider. Again, stop to ask yourself some questions. Try to consider how your child ego state may have been influenced. Again, an honest inventory of how you have been affected can help you identify the changes you would like to make. As we mature, more of our interactions with others call for us to be in our adult ego state. In fact, much of the conflict we experience is a result of not using the adult ego state characteristics. Take caution about overdoing this state. This can lead to social limitations. For example, if you and some friends are washing your car and a water fight breaks out, it may be totally appropriate to let your free child loose and join in the fun. Many of the characteristics of the adult ego state affect nonverbal communications. If you truly believe that we are all products of the various influences in our lives, you can genuinely begin to respect others. This genuine respect can have a very positive effect on body language, facial expression, and tone of voice. It can make a person seem more approachable and foster a true peer-to-peer exchange. Think of yourself as being the recipient of these characteristics, and think about how they would make you feel and how it would make you respond. This is the ego state whereby you take control and integrate the characteristics that you would like to live by. Are you beginning to get a sense of empowerment? Understanding your specific ego states, how they are being expressed, and how you would like them to develop brings clarity to an otherwise chaotic journey. We have now reached the point where we can begin to use TA on a personal level. This activity involves constructing a bar graph that we can use to assess what percentage of our time is spent expressing each of our ego states. A worksheet will follow this slide to help you make your assessments. The first step will be to assess your current percentages and place them on the bar graph. The second step will be to assess how you would like to change the amount of time you spend on each ego state and place them on the bar graph as your targeted adjustments. Note that the total percentage of time should add up to 100%. That is 100% for the current and 100% for the target. Now let's take a look at the worksheet. Consider the positive attributes of the critical parent and estimate what percentage of your time you express these attributes. Enter this estimate in the second box in the left-hand column. Now consider the negative attributes and place this estimate in the third box down on the left-hand column. Add these two estimates up and place the total in the first box in the left-hand column. Now think about how you would like to change these percentages and put your estimates in the target column. Repeat this process for each of the ego states until you have a set of estimates that will add up to 100% in each column. Now you have something to work with. You can look at your current view, compare it to your target view, and see what attributes you would like to express more often in your interactions with others. I mentioned earlier that we are complex creatures. If you think about your 5 ego states, each with its own voice and agenda, and then consider the fact that whoever you are interacting with also has 5 voices, that's 10 ego states interacting. How's that for complexity? On top of all that, we add the nonverbal elements of facial expression, tone of voice, and body language. It's no wonder that there are so many issues centered around communications. The good news is that we have a tool like TA to bring some order and control to what often seems chaotic. Keep in mind that although you are willing to compromise and be flexible, that does not mean that you will accept inappropriate behavior or allow others to push you around. Be true to your values and beliefs, and know your boundaries. If or when boundaries are challenged, use your assertive behaviors to clearly communicate them and let the other person know that your tolerance has limitations. Another complication you may encounter in your transactions is covert messaging. This is the case when someone says one thing but actually means another. Dr. Byrne recognized these exchanges and referred to them as games. They are fairly common and can be managed well by the adult ego state if they are recognized. In this example, the phrase, "Are you going to wear that shirt?" appears to be a straightforward adult question. But looks can be deceiving. What appears to be an adult-to-adult complimentary exchange is actually coming from the critical parent. Quite often, the response to a critical parent comes from one of the child egos. In this game, the other adult may again respond with a seemingly straightforward adult response. However, there is a covert meaning originating from the child. Becoming adept at recognizing these dynamics opens the door to managing them in a more effective manner. Now, instead of joining in the game, you can recognize the situation and respond from the adult ego state by being clear, direct, and seeking more information. Now let's turn our attention to how the ego states may be operating internally. In other words, our internal dialogue. Hopefully by now, you see that the concept of ego states makes sense, and perhaps you have been able to analyze some transactions and identify the ego states at work. So if you accept the basic concept, it may not be too difficult to accept that the ego states communicate internally. Do you find that thoughts are constantly running through your mind? Have you ever considered that they have a conversational aspect to them? You may notice that different thoughts have the quality of different ego states. I find it helpful to imagine my internal conversations to be similar to a board meeting with 5 different members, each with their own agenda. This image allows me to quickly assess which ego state is in the chairperson's seat. If I find that an ego state other than my adult is running the meeting, I have the potential for an ineffective transaction. The more adept I become at recognizing this, the greater control I have over being able to respond to situations rather than react. Developing the skills and using TA principles takes time and practice. At first, we just practice recognizing which ego state is active. This allows us to be aware of our tendencies to react rather than respond. As this skill develops, we can become more intentional in our responses. Eventually, the skills become second nature, and our dialogues, both internally and intrapersonally, become more effective. We experience a marked improvement in reducing anger, resentment, and frustration. Here are some suggestions that may help you to develop your skills. Remember, practice makes progress. Well, I hope this presentation has been useful for you. Here are a few tips to consider as you build your skills. Well, that pretty much concludes the presentation, and I wish you the best of luck in developing your skills. As a final note, students at FGCU can also participate in a workshop that covers this presentation. The advantage of attending the workshop is that it is interactive, can help clarify any questions you may have. Also, students can feel free to contact me via email if you would like more information about the services offered at our center.